Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Sunday Stream. As you can tell by down below on your screens, you can see that this is a premiere and not live. This was recorded last Saturday on the 21st of May, 2022, and I am joined today, as you can tell by the presentation on your screen, by Mr. Raging Mandrill, who has some wonderful insight and knowledge to drop on us today. But first of all, Mr. Mandrill, how are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you. It's been a good Saturday so far. Looking forward to this.
Great. So let's really just dive into it. What exactly are we going over today?
Okay, so we're going to just go over a brief review over the basic technical specifications and equipment and also weapons and engineering load of the FFG-62. And including in that, I'm going to give my analysis as a former surface warfare officer on my take on what exactly this ship is intended to do and what the emphasis is going to be as far as I can tell here. So I don't mean to make this like a super formal presentation or anything. I kind of just want this to be somewhat casual, but there is some very crucial information and updates. What it says? Yeah, it says 62. It's a 62.
You said 42. That's why I was
did
just
I say 42?
Like, yeah.
Oh, dang it. Well, it's the FFG-62. Yes.
There you go.
So there you go. Thank you. It's right in front of my face. I'm looking at it right now, and yeah. But yes, I don't intend for this to be super formal. This is mostly just my observations, technical specifications, etc., and where I think the U.S. Navy is going to head based upon these sorts of trends.
So, ladies and gentlemen, this Sunday you don't get to hear too much of my voice unless I'm asking questions. The only thing you'll really hear from me is when Mandrill says next slide. So we're going to just change our little camera view here to this, and I'm going to let Mr. Monkey Man take it away now. Here we go.
Okay. All right. So this is the FFG-62 review. Next slide, please. All right. So the FFG-62, also known as the Constellation class, is a prospective class of new frigate that the U.S. Navy is building. And it is being preceded by the former Oliver Hazard Perry class, which the United States Navy doesn't use anymore, but foreign navies still have it in active service. And also the Independence and Freedom LCS classes. So far, we have 3 ships that have been planned to be built, which is the Constellation, Congress, and the Chesapeake. So an interesting fact about this class of ship is that it is named after the original 6 frigates of the United States Navy. As you can see, those 6 ships are the Constitution, Congress, Chesapeake, President, Constellation, and the United States. So there's an interesting little culture aspect to this, which I would briefly touch on. There was a book or a couple of books a few years ago about the War of 1812 that made it on, I believe, Admiral Greenert's CNO reading list. That was about a decade ago now. But it's interesting because those 2 books were 1812 and also 6 frigates. From a cultural perspective, the War of 1812 is a very important war in the history of the United States. It really is when the Navy actually becomes important, like actually strategically important for national defense, etc. So you can see that it's also the first technical victory of the United States Navy, and not just a Navy that relies, like in the Revolutionary War, on a lot of letters of marque and more privateering things. So it is actually the U.S. Navy which did the majority of fighting there. So next slide, please. and you get a nice, wonderful, beautiful digital picture of that. I will ask you from time to time, Prud, to go back to this screen because the audience members will need to understand the physical location of some of the equipment that I'm talking about on the ship. Right. Obviously, you got everything from stem to stern. The bow of the ship is in the forward part of the ship. The stern is in the rear part of the ship where you see the helicopter and the flight deck. Right. The port side is the left side of the ship. So if you are on the bridge there where the glass windows are in the front, if you're looking straight out towards the bow of the ship, the port side will be on your left-hand side. The starboard side will be on your right side. So that's just my brief note about like physical layout. Next slide, please. All right. So as for basic specifications, it's going to cost the United States about $1.25 billion for the first ship, and about a little over $1 billion for each ship after that. Right. Every single ship class that gets built, the first one that's built is always typically a little bit more expensive. There's a lot of like things that need to be worked out, kinks, etc. So every ship that follows the first one, like it's a little bit more efficient to get it into service. So it's about 7,300 tons fully loaded with all of its ammo and fuel, etc. It's just under 500 feet in terms of length and around 65 foot in terms of width. It has an 18-foot draft, and it has a speed of around 26 knots. This is the listed speed of 26 plus. It has, of course, you have a cruising speed, which is where the nautical mile range comes from. So that's about 6,000 nautical miles at 16 knots. It has a crew of about 200 people. Of course, it has, like all ships, it has a couple ribs, a couple small boats, and has the ability, obviously, to have a air complement of one MH-60 Romeo Seahawk or M8QC Fire Scouts, which is the Navy's drone. So next slide, please.
Before we move to the next slide, perhaps maybe some things that to clarify for the audience would be what would be a draft and what does a rib stand for?
Oh, okay. So a rib is basically the acronym stands for Rigid Hull Inflatable Boat. It is essentially a boat with an actual the bottom portion or the hull, which is rigid. In other words, it's like fiberglass or it could be metal, depending on like the construction. But it has an actual inflatable sponson on the side, which is what helps keep it afloat. So it's not actually all made of metal or all made of fiberglass like other like fishing boats or your average commercial yacht. It actually has a rubberized sponson around the side. So that's just what that means. Draft is how deep the ship is going to sit in the water, right? So this is how deep the ship will be. This is important because this greatly limits where the ship can actually physically go in the water. Other Navy warships have deeper drafts. Like, for example, the cruisers and the destroyers have a draft of around 26, 28 feet or so, or even higher than that, like 30 feet. So this really does make it so that your limitations of where exactly you can go and how close in the littoral zone, that is how close to shore you can get, this starts to become a factor. So if you are a ship that is trying to engage in counter piracy operations, like, for example, what the LCS class, what part of their mission capability set is supposed to address is to have a very shallow draft. So this is just another ship that has kind of a shallow draft. And if you look at the LCS ships and also the former Oliver Hazard Perry class, you'll see a similar thing with very shallow draft as well. So that's not out of the realm of possibility for this kind of craft, right? This is to be expected for it to have a shallow draft like that.
All right. Well, then here we go.
All right. So this is not actually what the FFG-62 actually has. I just found this graph extremely hilarious because it is the most managerial looking graph that I could possibly find. However, this is interesting to note because it has all of the equipment listed. Like you can see the watercraft, the 7-meter ribs, which we just addressed. It has possible aviation. It's all of its capabilities. But this is all from the proposal, right? So this is what the craft was originally supposed to have. It does not have everything that is listed on here. But this, I just found it very interesting because this is exactly how Big Navy is going to think about things. And okay, this is what the capability it has in this area. This is what it doesn't have. And it's just a very obviously color-coded and managerial graphical way of representing things, which I find interesting.
And to clarify, before we get any further, I should have said this at the beginning. All of the information that is on here, of course, is not classified. This is publicly available record info that you could look up.
Yes. None of what we're telling you is under any sort of classification. The general things like very, very specific things will be classified. Just general information like how long a craft is, how many feet of beam it is, its draft. None of that stuff is classified. The actual speed is, which is why you will always get a 26 plus number if you look at other classes of ship. Like if you were to look in things like Jane's warships, you will see that every single warship has a speed listed like say 30 plus, because the actual technical speed is classified, but they just have a general ballpark number, which for our purposes is perfectly usable.
All right, good to know. Shall we carry on here? Is there anything specifically that, other than just this graph's managerialness, that we want to focus on?
No, I have everything listed in the next slide that actually the ship is actually equipped with. So
All right.
we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so of course the Constellation class frigate has several things in its electronic suite. It has an Aegis system, right? So this is the United States Navy, the U.S. Navy's preeminent, air defense system. Included in that is the spy radar system. So obviously this has the Spy 6, which is one of the newer variants because this is a newer class ship. It has the good old Spiz 73, which is a surface search radar. This is a difference because this is actually looking for surface contacts on the water itself rather than actually looking for aircraft. Of course, it has a Slick 61, which is a lightweight towed array sonar. It has a SQS 62, which is a variable depth sonar, right? So this is your hull mounted sonar, right, as opposed to a towed array sonar, right? So the SQQ 89 Foxtrot, this is its undersea warfare and anti-submarine combat system. This is it's like imagine if you think of like a computer that's taking a sensor and compiling all of your data together, right? This is what it does. It also has CEC, which is the cooperative engagement capability, which is very nice. It also has a Slick 32, which is this is the Surface Electronic Warfare and Program Block 2. Slick 32 is just another electronics sensor. And it also has the Mark 53 Nolka decoy launching system. And of course, the Nolka is a decoy, so it's meant to prevent your ship from getting shot. So you launch a decoy in the case of you being shot at a missile, and this decoy will send out an electronic signal, which is supposed to confuse a missile, so it won't actually hit your vessel. Next slide, please. Okay, so after all of the electronics equipment, which most of that stuff is very, very new, it's newer than the older stuff on the. It's just the older warships, right? But they're all pretty much similar electronic systems. If you look on Wikipedia, you'll see that the terminology doesn't change very much. They're very similar to older pieces of equipment there, but they're just newer versions. What is new, and what I kind of wanted to touch on because it's fascinating, is part of the engineering plant, right? So a major issue with the newer LCS classes of ship are their engineering plants. There have been, multiple incidents, and if you even like a standard Google search will pull up news articles and the Navy Times and stuff, and you can see that there is a consistent problem with the LCS crafts engineering plants. As far as I can tell, one of the reasons why this is the case is that the LCSs are a very, very novel warship. There's a lot that is very new with them, and to a certain extent, kind of experimental. And the engineering plants are one of the experimental things that was changed. So, in order to address this, from what I understand, the Constellation class actually will, create a physical on land engineering plant where they can physically build an engineering plant, a propulsion plant, to test out things before they put it into an actual ship, which I found interesting and sensible. So as far as the engineering plant goes, it has an LM 2500 plus gas turbine engine, which is not really any different. That's kind of par for the course for a lot of the Navy warships, especially the Ticonderoga class and the Arleigh Burke class cruisers. What is different is that it also uses diesel generators and also congruently electrical motors to help propel the actual ship through the water. So you can see, obviously, it has the four generators. It has the electric motors right there, very clearly visually seen, which attach to the reduction gear, which attaches to the propeller shaft, which attaches to the propeller, which is actually spinning in water to propel the ship through the water. Right. It also has an auxiliary propulsion unit, which is something we haven't seen since the Oliver Hazard Perry class. The Oliver Hazard Perry class actually had a couple of APUs, so that's kind of like a residual thing that's made a resurgence back in the engineering plants. This is not something that gets used, has been used for a while. The physical layout of this engineering system that you see in front of you is called CODLAG. It is combined diesel and gas propulsion, meaning it has a gas turbine and it also has a diesel and generator powering electric motors, which propel the ship. Why would somebody change the engineering plant to do this? Well, if you, like, for example, in the Arleigh Burke and Ticonderoga class ships, have gas turbines propelling your propeller shaft, and also you have gas turbines generating the electricity to keep the lights on, there are some advantages and disadvantages. The advantage of having a gas turbine is that it's very, very good at high speeds. However, it's somewhat fuel inefficient at lower speeds. And of course, this is a gas turbine, right? So it's like a jet engine in a box, right? You can literally see that on the screen. It literally looks like a jet engine in a box right there. So if you can imagine how fuel efficient, like a jet engine, which is something that powers an aircraft in a ship, it's really good at high speeds, but once you start cycling down into lower speeds, that is very, very fuel inefficient, right? So that's kind of why we've opted for this sort of like two-tier system, if you can think about it in that way, right? The gas turbine is there for high speeds, and the diesel generator and charging an electric motor is there for lower speeds. So it makes it just a little bit more fuel efficient in lower speed classes. So if you could go to the next slide, please. Okay, so like I said, it increases fuel efficiency, especially at lower speed. However, it also provides an additional benefit, right? Electrical powering of propulsion systems is much quieter. For example, diesel submarines are notoriously quiet, even since the World War II days, because they use a diesel engine and use the diesel engine while they're on the surface to charge to charge an electrical battery. Then they will go back to underwater, and they'll use the electrical battery to actually power their propulsion system and keep the lights on. This is a notorious weakness of diesel submarines, because in the especially in the World War II days, you had to come to the surface once at about every 24 hours to charge your battery, basically, and run a diesel engine, which requires oxygen. A lot of modern diesel submarines don't have this problem as much anymore. They've technologically found ways around that, so it's less of a problem. But I just know that that is something that has historically been the case in the past. Okay, so like I've said, this is the difference between the gas turbine engine and cod lag, right? So the Arleigh Burke class and the Ticonderoga class ships have this thing called COGAG, which is a combined gas and gas, right? So you have the two gas turbines, which feed into the reduction gear and drive the propeller shaft. And usually you have about two gas turbines, two on each side, right, powering each shaft. So you have four turbine engines total, which feed two into each shaft, right? So it's 2-to-1. However, you also have three gas turbine generators, which are online and actually powering the ship. Those are completely separate from the actual propulsion system, right? They're just there for powering the electrical system, if that makes sense. So you can see there's, if you can go back to the previous slide, please. So you can see that there's kind of a slight difference here in that the actual, power generation happens, not really connected to the actual propulsion system, right? The actual way that you can generate power is not directly connected to your actual propulsion, other than connecting to the electric motors. So that's an interesting little factoid that I found for this particular warship. Now, I'm not somebody who's an engineering expert. My background is not in engineering. I do have generalized training with it, like all military officers in the Navy do. But it's interesting, right? Because this is something that seems to be very much a middle ground between the previous generation of the OHP frigate class, which used uh, a turbine propulsion exclusively, and also utilized, the LCS classes have a very strange engineering layout, right? A very unique engineering layout. So this is just a very clear difference where they're actually starting to combine technology which has been known and has been around for a long time, but they've just started making it so that they can alternate it together and get a better product altogether, if that makes sense.
Anything else that we need to add, or?
No, not for the engineering plant right now. It's just, yep.
All right, cool. Then we'll move on. Past the benefits, and then on to the fun stuff.
Yes. Okay, so here's the fun stuff, right? All right, so as for armament, the Constellation class is planned to have the Mark 41 VLS. It'll have 32 cells in that VLS. Now, we don't exactly know what it will be loaded out with, possibly with the ESSM system, or the the more classical standard missiles, specifically the SRM-6, which is the extended range standard missile. However, it could also take the SM-2 Block 3 Charlie, which is the the latest block of SM-2 missile, right? Which is the just normal SM-2 missile that the United States Navy uses for all of its air defense purposes right now. The SM-6 is kind of a new thing. It's very new. I would expect that you likely would see it loaded out with ERAM, with the RIM 164 that you see at the top. And the reason why I say that is obviously because it only has 32 cells, which compared to the Arleigh Burke class, the Arleigh Burke class has 96 cells, and the cruiser has 122. So that's a significant reduction in air defense firepower, right? Obviously, this is, compared to an Arleigh Burke class cruiser, this is, reducing your firepower by like 60%, right? So it's a huge problem for this particular vessel, that just looking at it off the bat. However, it does, it can overcome this deficiency by using a longer range missile, right, which is the SRM-6. So I'm not exactly sure what Big Navy's planning to do with this, but that's just based upon what I know. That's probably what they will choose to do, because obviously that's an engineering limitation of the weapon system. So if I were in their shoes and just the way that I think, I would have my best asset being fired from a smaller weapon system, because I want the best chance of shooting down an enemy aircraft or an incoming missile. So the next thing is, and this is the biggest thing, is that it has 16 canister launched over the horizon anti-ship weapons. Now it has, I don't think it's been confirmed yet. That is possibly the NSM, which is the Naval Strike Missile, which I'll have a slide later. We will get to that. However, the thing that is important to notice here is compare this to, say, the Arleigh Burke or the Ticonderoga class. The Arleigh Burke and Tycho classes have 8 Harpoon missiles, which is the Navy's surface-to-surface anti-ship cruise missile. Right. So obviously this says 16. Obviously, this is an increase in anti-surface firepower of about 100%, right? So this is pretty significant in terms of what this ship's intention is, right? All Navy surface ships have to be able to address multiple threats, which are anti-surface. They have to be able to at least be able to effectively address the air threat, which is extremely critical. And they've also got to be able to address the subsurface threat. Obviously having 16 over-the-horizon anti-ship weapons rather than a mid-range weapon like the Harpoon, which has been around for about 50 years and is really starting to show its age in comparison to some of the newer Russian and Chinese missiles. This is something that seems to be able to address that, as we're choosing more volume in terms of firepower from missiles. And obviously this is an over-the-horizon weapon, which is has greater range than the standard block Harpoon, right? Now also, of course, it has the RIM 116 rolling airframe missile, which is launched from the Mark 49 guided missile launching system, which has 21 cells. So this is just another close-in air missile defense system. It also has the Mark 110 57 millimeter gun with the Alamo, which is the low-cost munition, and it also has the M240 and M2 machine gun. That every Navy ship has. So for the Mark 110 and the machine guns, those are going to be used for small craft. If there's any sort of conflict with Iran, or even China to some extent has a lot of small craft, that's what I would expect the 57 millimeter and the M240 or M2 machine guns to be used upon. And you can actually go look up YouTube footage of the 57 millimeter. It's pretty cool in terms of how quick it can fire. It's very surprising. So that goes for that slide, I think. All right, so we will continue by giving a little bit of a background on the Naval Strike Missile. So obviously this is a missile that is of Norwegian design. It weighs around 900 pounds total in terms of weight. It has a pretty standard length and size warhead for what you'd expect for most countries to have. Obviously, it has the fuse is different. You can program it. It's range dependent. The listed range on Wikipedia is 100 to 300 nautical miles. This is what it is meant by over the horizon, which is compared to a more mid-range range of Harpoon. So it's high subsonic, like a lot of different missiles out there today. A lot of countries run subsonic missiles, which use active seekers in the sort of middle range. So obviously, in terms of guidance, it's got an inertial navigation system. It has TERCOM, which is the terrain contour mapping, like same as the TLAM, the Tomahawk missiles have. It's got a target database, which is interesting and new, and as far as I know, that's pretty unique to this missile. And also has infrared homing, which is different, right? That's a different kind of seeker than the Harpoon uses. The Harpoon has an active seeker, which essentially means that the Harpoon sends out a radar ping, and it will receive a radar return depending on what is out there. If there's a surface craft, it will get a radar return, which tells it that there's something there. The infrared homing, I think, is pretty interesting, simply because not a lot of missiles use that. Some of them do, but I find that a lot of the more infrared stuff is more like the AGM-114 Hellfire, at least not the longbow variant, if I remember correctly, the earlier variants. So it's interesting that this one does use that, because most missiles that you would be able to look up, like say an Exocet or a Harpoon, those things, and the Charlie 803 or the YJ-83, which is the Chinese and Russian variants of similar missiles, right? Those all use active seekers, right? Everybody has a similar missile, but this is interesting because it uses infrared homing. Which, if for those who don't know, infrared is basically, it means heat seeking, right? So that's a fascinating element that you could really delve down into the decision making as to why they decided to make it that way. My personal opinion is there's a lot of I guess you would say tactical shenanigans that you could perform in order to attempt to fool a incoming active seeker missile. Everybody has an active seeker missile, right? So of course everybody is going to have some sort of countermeasure against an active seeker, right? The Mark 53 Nilka is a perfect example of what the U.S. Navy uses, and of course all of our friends have the same thing. So if you think about every country having an active seeker, every country having a countermeasures for active seekers, and also having the ability to jam those weapons. You can see that there's and also because they're very slow, right? A subsonic missile is relatively slow. This is not really a problem, in my opinion, for the U.S. Navy, and that's given the Mosca situation, which I'll get into in a second. But it's just the idea that there's an infrared homing mechanism on this particular missile is fascinating to me, just because that's different and unique and somewhat new that they chose to use that homing device on this particular weapon system. So another thing to note is the cost, right? This is a very expensive missile, right? It's almost $2.2 million, right? A Harpoon missile or other, if you were to look it up, other missiles out there that have active seekers, all of those weapons are about $1 million a pop, right? So if you think about these weapons as if they are bullets, right? how many bullets does it take to kill somebody, right? Well, usually more than one if you want to be sure, right? So probably like if you're smart, you'd probably shoot two at a time. The issue here is like obviously cost, right? How many missiles do you have, right? If you're going to shoot more than one missile, like for example, like we saw with the Moskva, right? Obviously, the Ukrainians shot like two missiles at the Moskva, right? This is if you're shooting at somebody with missiles and they shoot down one, you still want to be able to get them with another one at roughly the same time. So it's interesting that it costs so much for me. A lot of other missiles, if you look at other Chinese or Russian missiles, the more expensive ones will cost around a similar amount. So it's interesting, and it's a very good thing, in my opinion, that the U.S. Navy is investing in its missile capabilities. Other Russian and Chinese missiles, the more advanced ones, are like intended to be designed to go after to penetrate American air missile defense systems, which is why part of the reason why I think they're so fast. This one is not that fast. So at least for me, I kind of am of the opinion that the effectiveness of the American air defense systems and the, I guess, comparative ineffectiveness of the old Soviet air defense systems on the pre-Aegis warships it means that they're still somewhat vulnerable to subsonic missiles, right? They don't need to be fast to get through their air defenses. So that's just some interesting asides there. And this is not. You have any questions, Prude, or anything?
No,
I've been rambling. I feel like I've been rambling for a while. So,
well, welcome to me every Sunday when I don't have a guest. But no, this has been highly informative, and I look forward to hearing your take on the Moskva situation very soon.
Yeah. Okay. So actually, this is probably a good time to get into that, right? Okay. So, one of the capabilities of and one of the good things of the American electronics systems is the ability to be able to have like data links and ways to pass information to other assets, right? This isn't just World War II where you see an inbound aircraft on a radar screen and man the guns, sound general quarters, and things like that. No, we like any country that is worth its salt is going to be able to have the ability to start passing firing data to other warships in case they have a better angle of shot or whatever. So one of the good things about CEC is that that's kind of what it's intended to do, as well as link 11, link 16. So the things that I noticed with the Moskva sinking was that from what the Russians were saying, and I had my suspicions early on about this whole situation, right? Because the Russians claimed that they had air, superiority, not air supremacy, air superiority over the Ukrainians, right? And if you were noticing the Russians and how they were claiming, okay, we got this radar installation destroyed, we destroyed this one. It's quite a lot, right? You can't just claim to have air supremacy and not have a very significant advantage over somebody's air defense systems. Another reason why I thought this was the case is because some of the gouge that was coming out of the Ukrainians was that their radar systems, from some of the rumors and things that we saw, were that they were kind of immobile, right? They're the old Soviet S-300 system, if I remember correctly. And they pretty much are all located towards the western portion of the country, like the rest of the Ukrainian army. The ones that weren't able to be maintained probably got destroyed in the first couple weeks of the war. just because if you are somebody who is trying to achieve an air advantage, you want to make sure that your enemy's radars are inoperational, right? You don't want them to have any sort of early warning radar or anything like that, so you can basically operate your aircraft in their airspace with impunity, and they won't be able to scramble fighters against you. So I found it very interesting that the Ukrainians were able to launch any sort of missiles towards the Moskva at all, right? In order to be able to fire like a missile, even an active seeker missile like the ones that the Ukrainians fired, which, as I said before, they're very similar in type to a lot of the active seeker missiles. They're subsonic. They have a couple 100-pound warhead. They're about $500,000 a pop. It's not enough that it can seek targets on its own. You still have to be able to give it a direction to go. It still has to know basic things like how fast is your target going, what direction is it heading in, like how far away is it, and of course what direction is it in, right? You need a couple things in order to be able to shoot a missile, right? You don't. And the thing with active seeker missiles is because they have a radar return, is they will go after anything that looks like a big hunking piece of metal on the water, right? So they're very sensitive in that regard. So you can't just fire at anything out there and hope that it hits something. That's extremely irresponsible, because what happens if there's somebody's fishing boat out there, or if there's a merchant craft that is a friendly that you don't necessarily want to hit? So you're going to need some basic information. Like, this is not even like high powered stuff, like getting into IFF and things like that. Active seeker missiles aren't that don't need to be that sophisticated. But the interesting thing about that is how did the Ukrainians get that information? Well, as it turns out, the DoD actually admitted a few weeks ago in a news article, I forget which one it was, I think it might have been one of the DoD affiliated outlets, that actually, yes, we did give the Ukrainians targeting information to sink the Moskva. And how did we give them that information? Well, of course, we're going to use one of our electronics systems to share that information. So that is something that I found fascinating. And it's interesting because that's pretty significant, that you're sharing an actual targeting data to somebody else that that is not even allied with you, and is that you're involved in a proxy war with, that you're not really looking to get involved in anything more than a proxy war, or that you shouldn't be. So I found that information extremely interesting, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I found and I'll talk about this. I know this is recording today, but for those who watched tomorrow's stream, Sunday the 22nd, which is, I'm trying to mess with the scheduling here. I'll be talking a little bit about that tomorrow. Just the rhetoric of how insane it is that, like, we're talking about wartime and escalating a situation, and to me it kind of does lend credence almost 100%, actually 100%. This kind of proves the point where they claim that the Americans are fighting Russia to the very last Ukrainian.
Yes, it's also I think it's also a provocation, right? If you are going to share that kind of data with somebody who's not an ally with you, and you're also not at war with Russia, but you're going to share targeting information, which the Ukrainians are going to be able to utilize to great effect. I mean, that's pretty scuzzy. We can have a whole conversation about the ethics of war and things like that. But to me, it's more than just providing aid. Everybody who gets involved in proxy wars does this. All of the major powers since Lend-Lease have done similar things, like sharing weapons and ammo and helmets and tanks and things like that, right? To get involved in proxy war. This is much more interesting, where you're actually using targeting information so that you're I guess, proxy war puppet state is going to be able to use that information so that they can launch their anti-ship cruise missiles into your surface vessels. It's fascinating to see that, because when you start like where is the line exactly in terms of what is permitted to be allowable and before you actually declare war, right? If in my view, like the fact that we gave them that information through one of our maritime craft, which I think, if I remember correctly, was probably a P8 or something. Um, that's it gets into the territory of it being a deliberate provocation because we admit it to it, right? Um, and that's kind of why I feel like that was something that was intended to bloody Russia's nose and make them make a mistake, because that is a very, very gray line, where technically that could be interpreted as an act of war, but of course Russia does not want to go to war with the United States at this current time. So I don't know. It's just one of those things where you're like you're poking the Russian bear, hoping that it will bark and bite, and so that you can shoot it, sort of thing. Um, they're just the current system is very good at doing that, as I'm sure you know.
Yeah, I am gravely concerned at just why you want to just flex this. I mean, they know that we're doing this. They know that the entire Western US led bloc is giving money, aid, arms, intel, complete media coverage. And I mean, this does obviously illustrate the strength of sort of the American led system. Like, well, this is kind of a clear de facto just I mean, even the realists were talking about this forever ago. Like when there was military buildup before the invasion, it was just like, this is not a kind of war that, or military buildup that the Russians can just sort of walk on in and march straight to Kiev, especially not after what 6 years plus of the Americans and the West pretty much giving the Ukrainians aid and arms and intel since 2014. This is just a sort of the dangerous thing. And I mean, of course, I think the regime would like to finalize this. I mean, there's been more than enough blue checks and talking heads and DC people that have talked openly about regime change. We tried it with Alexander Navalny. Like, all these things have happened. And it's just that gray line. At one point in time, you're going to poke it and it will bite. And I don't think that anyone is remotely prepared for what that will look like.
Yeah. My one um, uh, glimmer of hope here is, from so far what we have seen, it doesn't look like Vladimir Putin is taking the bait on that. Um, I mean, this is a very deliberate provocation, and I think to be very honest, if just, I mean, what you wouldn't give to be a fly on the wall in the Pentagon when these conversations are happening, right? But I almost, just my spidey sense is kind of going off and is telling me that this is probably some kind of return, of the bloodying of the nose for placing his nuclear forces on high alert, back in February or March timeframe. So this is probably a similar deal, right? He's kind of escalated, a little prematurely by doing that, and so we're going to respond, obviously. But yeah, the giving of tactical information, especially any sort of like tactical data, is pretty significant. And yeah, that's a very gray line there. Um, the one thing I will say, on this particular, just to tie it all together in terms of this ship, and why I'm focusing on this particular missile so much, and why this missile probably will be equipped on this particular vessel, is that the um, this missile, in terms of its range, because it's over the horizon, um, is very, very similar in its range to other missiles that the old Soviet bloc had developed, and that other ones that the Chinese have, because obviously everything that the Chinese have is ex-Soviet, in addition to their homebrew stuff. So it's kind of this is one of the major criticisms that has been made of the U.S. Navy in recent decades, is that the Harpoon has not really kept up in terms of its comparable range to other missiles that other nations have developed. In the Cold War, it was sufficient, right? Just because the emphasis was on the carrier firepower, and you just need something, some sort of missile to respond to enemy, vessels, right? That's the fact that the Russians and the Chinese have such comparably good missiles from the Soviet era, which are extremely fast, which have multiple targeting systems. They're very clever, right? The missile just doesn't just fly in a straight line. I mean, maybe the really really old ones do, but a lot of them, especially the older active seeker missiles, um, like of the 1970s era, have this weird tendency to have a sea skimming mode, where they'll fly very close to the water surface and then they'll pop up at the last second and attack the ship that they'll explode at the ship where they're targeting. Like I've said before on your stream and on others, very similar to how the Argentinians in the Falklands engaged the British fleet, because they didn't really have a whole lot of active seeker missiles. Like they had a couple exocets, but they used bombs mostly. So from why this is significant is that this represents a addressing of what the criticisms of the U.S. Navy are. And it seems to me that in order to address this imbalance in terms of anti-ship cruise missile research and development, the U.S. Navy has chosen a conservative direction, but a necessary one, right? One that's not outside the realm of possibility. This is an improvement over what they already have in terms of the range. It might be a possible improvement because of its homing mechanism with the infrared homing, but this ship obviously is a much more dedicated surface-to-surface combatant than the Arleigh Burkes or the Ticonderoga class cruisers. Okay, like I mentioned previously, all surface warships have to have the ability to defend themselves from subsurface, from surface, and from air threats. Right, a surface vessel in the modern era is extremely vulnerable as an asset, right? Because not only are you fighting other surface assets like in the old battleship days, the air warfare is the most decisive element and aspect of combat, and especially in terms of sea combat, right? Which we saw since the World War II, right? Surface ships are still extremely vulnerable to subsurface assets as well. But the point is, this asset has the ability to launch, 16 missiles of whatever design they're going to equip it with, which is 100, like double the firepower of in terms of surface to surface as what other Navy ships have. So it's a much more dedicated asset, whereas the Arleigh Burke and Ticonderoga class cruisers, while they are still workhorses, while they still can do everything, their true purpose and their true role is as air defense assets, right? That's where they really start to shine, because they have all of those massive VLS batteries on board the ship, right? So really, what I would expect the U.S. Navy to do with this particular vessel is to run it in tandem with another vessel. This is, you have a things called a surface action group, or you could even run, an actual, frigate squadron with, 2 or 3 ships, basically. Which is kind of similar to how other navies do it, in terms of, because we actually run our ships in the carrier strike group with a carrier and a cruiser and a couple destroyers, etc. Right. I would expect that this asset, because it is so unique, if it is not being run as a specifically an anti-surface asset that the carrier strike group will use to defend itself against other surface threats, I would expect this thing to be running with a couple of its sister ships at the same time in order to actually attack Chinese or Russian or whatever other assets are out there that we're trying to destroy. So that's what I would kind of expect them to do with this thing.
Do you expect that? I mean, this is, of course, the next sort of line in phase here for this particular class. So, are we expecting to see a significant number of these to be manufactured and deployed?
Um, Possibly. It does seem that if you notice the cost of the ship in the first couple of slides, it's about $1 billion expected for every like second and third and etc. ship. So just for cost comparison, the Arleigh Burke class, which is the newest class of destroyer, right, which we're still building and we're still constructing at the current moment, that costs about $2.3 billion, right? So that's about double of what this particular new class of frigate is intended to cost once the kinks get worked out. So, like the Oliver Hazard Perry class, which was specifically designed to be built to cost, as opposed to the American carriers, which are incredibly big, incredibly expensive assets. And of course, the Arleigh Burke class and our submarines are extremely expensive as well. So, if you have some resource constraints, but you still need a asset which is going to be able to be utilized effectively, the answer is, okay, well, I need a small ship which has the ability to get itself up to speed, like what the LCS was intended to do, which the LCS has a lot of speed, right? This is expected to attack other surface assets. So the but of course you need it to fit to the bill, right? It needs to fit to the budget. So if you can build one of these things or a lot of these things, which is kind of what I'm expecting, should this design prove to be sufficient, right? And given the little factors that we've mentioned here about the engineering plant being built on land, the Navy only ordering 3 of them at once, as opposed to the 10 or 20 of the LCS classes all at once. These are things that are very good. As I've mentioned before in previous streams, a lot of navies, the U.S. Navy in days of yore did this as well. They would build a class of ship with only 2 ships, and they would figure out what they wanted to change about it, and go from there and update it, and then save that for the next class of ships. And that's what the Chinese do. That's kind of what the Russians do. And hopefully, I'm really hoping that the U.S. Navy kind of does the similar thing, where it just builds 2 or 3 ships and then has them last for a little bit, like 2 or 3 years, and kind of figures out what the problems with them are and where improvements need to be made. So just as an aside, I believe these things are being constructed in Wisconsin. I think, which is interesting, right? Because obviously this is where the shallow draft becomes beneficial, right? Because you can actually have them go out in the Great Lakes, and you can have them, sail on the rivers out into the ocean, right? So you can actually build these things close in your very, very close into your interior of your country, and be able to have them exfil out that way because of that shallow draft. So that's one benefit, right? Also, just thinking of the manufacturing aspect, think of like how the system is going to gain loyalty again, right? How are you going to bring Ohio and Wisconsin back to the fold other than by trying to bring back manufacturing? I would imagine that if you start giving defense contracts to the Rust Belt, that's probably one way that you could attempt to do that, right? So that's another element of this.
Well, again, this is really informative for me because this is all new information. So
Yeah.
I'm really thankful that you came on. Do we have more slides after this?
I think this is it.
We'll see. Hold on. It is.
Yes.
Great.
Yes. See, that's a nice visual rendering of what the ship is supposed to look like. Obviously, it looks very similar to how other modern Navy warships are constructed. It kind of looks somewhat like a scaled down version of an Arleigh Burke, just given the shape of the mast there. And the deck house reminds me a little bit of the old Spruance class, which is the class of DD before the U.S. Navy built the Ticonderoga class cruisers. It also has a bow shape that looks very reminiscent of the cruisers as well. So that's a very interesting thing. Of course, as I mentioned before, this thing can only carry one helicopter, right? Because it's got, it's just a smaller ship. So these are the sorts of like little limitations that you think of, like the budgetary aspect of, like when you saw that original graph right in the beginning with the green shades of like, okay, this is what we want and this is what it's going to have and this is what it doesn't have. Like I would be very interested to see a filled in graph of that, of what it actually has, right? Because because this thing seems to be a scaling down in terms of cost and in terms of size, right? The Arleigh Burke class is over 500 feet. The cruisers are 567 feet long. And of course, they're deeper draft, so obviously there's more in the bottom and more space in the ship, right? A major aspect of ship development is always going to be, the space and the size of it, what its weapons loadout is, and speed, right? So the three factors, and of course cost, right? Those factors are going to play a major role in how a ship is constructed. And to me, it seems like this particular vessel is going to be um, um, taking newer weapon systems and putting them onto more tried and true proven design concepts, right? Not trying to reinvent the wheel quite literally in the case of the LCS programs with all the problems that they've been had and reputed to have. Um, this thing seems to me on paper to be a very solid warship for what it does. Now, if anyone who's been paying attention to what the Russians or the Chinese doing, they're building similar ships with these kinds of concepts, right? 450, to the 500-foot range. A lot of anti-ship cruise missiles, not so much anti-air warfare necessarily, but still capable at doing that job. And everything else still being a warship, right? This is in a lot of interesting things, and you can see that at least with the LCS program, the U.S. Navy got itself into kind of a bad way. It was criticized for not having enough armament, so the Navy decided that, okay, we'll address that with attempting to post construction of the class to attach the Harpoon weapon system onto those warships, specifically onto the Independence class. However, I've totally forgot. I'm so sorry. The LCS classes also have an aluminum hull, which, as anybody who is involved in many sort of metalworking knows, aluminum has a much lower melt point than steel, right? So if your ship catches fire or takes damage, it's less survivable than a steel ship, right? If you go back into old naval history, you will see pictures of older warships that had an aluminum superstructure like the Ticonderoga class cruisers do, and of course those things like caught fire and they burned to the water line basically. So I don't know what this one is like, considering that it looks like it's very low, much lower to the water. It doesn't have the incredibly tall deck houses that the cruiser does. Um, um, I would imagine that this will probably be all steel construction. Um, and just the miniaturization and the requirement to keep this thing in budget whilst also giving it just enough capability in all of the areas that it needs to, while still giving it a slight specialization in surface warfare is probably going to make this thing a relatively fearsome asset on the high seas. So from the perspective of on paper, this looks like something that the U.S. Navy will likely mass produce in the future, and relatively quickly too, because the LCSs need to get replaced sooner than they were planned to be. So
So I guess the question that comes to my mind, while aluminum is great because it's lighter, it's probably easier to work with in terms of manufacturing. I
No,
no, okay.
no. There's actually a problem with aluminum welders. It's not the actual manufacturing process. It's very difficult, but the qualification process for aluminum welders is, I think, a little bit more intensive than steel welding. There's actually, if I remember correctly, from my days in the in discussing this in service, aluminum welders are actually kind of in a shortage. So it gets backlogged very quickly, having to have aluminum constructed ships.
So that kind of comes into my mind what I hear from my friend who works at Raytheon about having sort of subject matter experts and guys who actually know how to do this stuff that they're kind of in short supply.
Yep, yep, that's
Okay.
pretty much par for the course.
So we do have it would be very safe to say that America's sort of defense platforms have a manpower problem, at least when it comes to actual make shit experts.
Yes, pretty much.
Oh, that's comforting. Well, I guess back to the aluminum thing though, since you had mentioned the lower melting point for temperature, then I guess what comes to my mind is that there's a lot more emphasis then on perhaps just like point blank defense. Like I know that this one we were talking about on the armaments. I'll quickly go back to it
Mm-hmm.
in regards to.
Oh, you skipped it.
Oh, I did. There
No,
we
one more.
go. Here we
There
go.
you go.
Yeah. So like, of course, M2 or M40s, but then the Mark 10 or 110. I just imagine that it's a less than 500 feet, but I mean it's like what 496. I'd
Mm-hmm.
imagine that they would want something to do more for, I guess, any sort of defense like that. I mean, like you had mentioned the concerns about air and missiles and all that. I'm curious if it's made of this kind of material or if there's that sort of direction. It seems that might not be enough, but I'm not. I don't know.
Okay, so the first thing is that most, like, if you consider the range, right? We're talking in hundreds of miles right now. A 57 millimeter gun, and like, hold on, let me see if I can pull up that weapon system so I can give you the Wikipedia range here. I don't think it's more than 13 miles or 10 miles, which is probably around what 5 inch is. Let me see here. Where is it? Doesn't say. Where's the range? Range. Ah, yes. Okay, so maximum firing range. So it says 19,000 yards with an HE round at 45 degrees. Okay. So in nautical miles terms, let me do some quick math. That's around 9.5 miles. Um, so that thing has a range of 9.5 miles max range. That's not what you're actually going to be firing it at. The difference between max effective range and maximum range, right? Maximum range is the maximum range that your projectile can fire, right? So, for example, like your maximum range for like an M2 or M240 machine gun is going to be like thousands of yards, but your like max effective range is going to be like 1100, or you're really going to be in the zone at around 500 yards, right? And the same thing with your AR rifle that you may own, which is around max effective range of around 500 meters or yards or so. Um, so but that's not the total the maximum range that the projectile can go, right? That's just how, like, where you want your projectile to be hitting your opponent so that you get good terminal effect on whatever you're shooting at, right? So the Mark 110, if you go look at what this thing can do on YouTube, right? It's extremely quickly firing, right? And then go look up what a Navy destroyer or Navy cruiser can shoot with a 5 inch, right? Which has a rate of fire of like I think 20 rounds a minute for the 5 inch gun, which is around one round every 3 seconds or so. The 57 millimeter is much quicker, right? So if you're trying to get a gun be able to shoot like small, very rapidly moving surface craft that are relatively close in. The 57 millimeters a much better asset for doing that, right? Um, um, the 5-inch gun, while it is capable, it has a wide variety of munitions. Um, its real intention and real purpose of what it's and of course obviously 5-inch can be, there's anti-air munitions for it as well that US Navy uses, but what its real intention and real purposes is for shore bombardment, right? There is a congressional mandate, if I remember correctly, that all surface assets have to have a gun system so that you can support amphibious landings. Now, how effective is a 57 millimeter gun going to be? That's anyone's guess. Like even a 5-inch gun is pretty wimpy when you consider that the uh, old Iowa class battleships were brought back in the 90s, the late 80s and early 90s with a 16-inch gun, right? And they had 5-inch secondary batteries. So I mean, it's this is one of those conversations of like, well, okay, you can do shore bombardment, but you're going to take casualties in shore bombardment from enemy artillery counter battery fire against your surface craft. But this is not the true purpose of that weapon, right? It's not. That's really a weapon system which is intended for more smaller craft or other surface vessels that actually do get within the 10-mile range, right? Whereas most naval combat is going to be done with missiles these days, right? This is not World War II anymore. Okay, so you have to understand, like, those 16 canister launch over the horizon anti-ship weapons are what is going to be employed. The things that the U.S. Navy uses in terms of anti-ship weapons is Harpoon at the current moment, right? So you just have to remember, like, this isn't Grandpa's Navy anymore. We use missiles these days. We use smart weapons these days. We have all sorts of like electronic warfare and countermeasures and data link systems that you can transfer data to other assets, et cetera, et cetera. This is a very different conception of how your grandpa fought, right? Ships do not just they don't always get in a straight line in a column formation like in World War One, like, or in the old World War II footage where all the battleships all line up and give broadside. That those days are long gone, right? This is it's more fluid, it's more dynamic, it's a lot, I guess you would say, quicker in terms of how fast weapons can travel over distance, and it's extremely different, right? It's very different from how most people conceptualize naval warfare. And I keep telling people, like, they really have to, if they want to understand like how modern naval warfare works, you probably should go read 100 Days by Admiral Woodward. And that will give you at least some conception of at least circa 40 years ago how naval warfare was conducted. Anyway, so that's my take on the 57 millimeter gun and what exactly this stuff is there to do. Right, the main armament on this ship is those 16 missile canisters, really. So,
Well, do you have any final thoughts that you want to add to your presentation, or just your take given your experience as a naval officer?
Yeah, I think I've kind of given my take. This is a very designed to cost, or at least apparently designed to some cost, with significant engineering constraints ship, which is at least it appears on paper to be specifically designed for surface to surface engagements, which is an area that the U.S. Navy currently, as it stands, is somewhat lacking in, and I think that's a legitimate criticism. From even in my time of service, this was stuff that people complained about. Obviously, the U.S. Navy relies very heavily on its carrier forces to do a lot of the fighting and to do a lot of the damage. Right, like even if it was to launch F-18s, those planes in naval warfare would probably be launched with Harpoon missiles. if they were involved in a surface to surface real like peer to peer engagement, right? Just because that's the best anti-ship weapon that we have, just because of its range and loadout and all the things that it has on it. Um, but these sorts of like little factors that I'm telling you, just think of like how this thing is going to operate in a real engagement where it actually, okay, it has the ability to shoot air assets. It can defend itself in the air. It has undersea capability, so it can defend itself from under the sea. It might not have as many sensors as, say, an Arleigh Burke or a Ticonderoga class cruiser does, but it still retains a lot of the data sharing capability with other warships. So it won't just be out on its lonesome. It's probably going to fight with another warship or two in a formation if it isn't actively acting in a carrier strike group. And, this seems to me to be a very capable asset and probably what, a U.S. Navy counter to the frigates that the Chinese and the Russians have, built very in recent years. So, I mean, this seems to be a workable platform. We'll see in future where this will go. And whether or not this particular missile, in combination with this platform, if it indeed is intended to be used with this platform, how effective this is going to be. But on paper, this looks like a capable warship. So I'm pleased with it, honestly. And, I think that at least, the U.S. military, so far, assuming no hiccups or anything, has probably done good in terms of its engineering. So this is a really, a kind of a comeback to Jesus moment for them in terms of like, okay, building something that actually works and actually has its capability, like, from start to finish of what it's intended to do, right? It has a purpose. Build it to its purpose, build it to cost so that you can build a bunch of these things.
Well, I really want to just again thank you for coming on and giving us this great presentation. I will add announcements at the end of this little section here, so don't go away just yet, everyone. But Mr. Mandrill, is there anything that you would like to shill, promote, want me to put in the description for everyone to look at?
Yes, actually, there are a couple things. Obviously, please check out my YouTube channel. If anyone wants to interact with me, I'm on Twitter and I'm on Telegram. I also have a Substack account, which I've recently published a symbolic analysis of the recent 2021 Dune movie. So if that's something you're interested in, please, by all means, go check that out. Also, I do have another article that I'm planning on publishing here pretty shortly along naval warfare lines, which is actually a analysis of the Battle of Manila Bay in accordance with the U.S. Army's 9 principles of warfare. So if military affairs are something that interests you, please go check out my Substack and await that, which will be coming out pretty shortly. So.
All right. Well, those links will be in the description. So if you are interested in any of these things or want to hear more of this gentleman's fine and wonderful takes, the links are down below in the description. I highly recommend that you go follow him on Twitter, Substack, and YouTube. He's a fantastic gentleman. Met him in real life. Great guy. So with all that being said, this will be the end of the presentation. What comes next will be, of course, announcements and the ever so wonderful Frog of the Week. But Mr. Mandrill, thank you so much for coming on, and I think we'll end the audio here.
Okay. Thanks for having me on.
No problem, man. Again, thank you so much to Raging Mandrill for that presentation. Hopefully you all managed to learn something from it. And again, links to his work down below in the description, his Substack, YouTube channel, and Twitter. As for announcements, here's what I've got going on for you in the coming days and weeks. I'm currently working on sort of a gentle introduction video to Garrett. Those of you who are familiar with his work, The Revolution Was, should know him quite well. Murray Rothbard referred to him as part of the American Old Right before during the times of the Great Depression and sort of the managerial revolution that came out of FDR. Simply a part of the right wing in the United States before the Buckleyite revolution, so to speak, or takeover. Of course, as always, Substack is sort of becoming this regular weekly thing. These essays, whether you read them or not, I always appreciate the feedback that you do. These are going to be part of a future collection of anthology of essays and whatnot, and short stories and poems that I'm going to hopefully have ready for publication by the year's end. I'll have probably 40 or 50 little short essays and ideas and pieces in it and so on. And it'll be a book for self publication. I'm trying to work more on my creative side, and I always appreciate those of you who are subscribed to the Substack. It's free for you all to enjoy and read and hear my thoughts. 500 of you are on there, which I greatly appreciate. Alongside that, do keep in mind the future content-minded podcast recording I did with Geo. He and I are planning to do more stuff regularly in the future. Not so much politics, but also just sort of cultural and artistic and philosophical observations of our day-to-day world. And I have to give him a lot of thanks because he has definitely done and said a lot of good things about me recently. And so I just wanted to say that for the video. Thank you very much, Gio. You've been a very good friend and guide for me as I start to come up with my own voice up and about here. And then in the meantime, while I work on some of these larger projects like the Gentle Introduction video and more scripted work, I am going to use some narration stuff from Substack, some of the older pieces, and I will use them to work on my video production quality. So better, camera stuff, better video intros and sound and recording. And I'm going to use this time to really hone my own abilities and sort of self-teach and work my way to make better content. So I greatly appreciate all the stuff that you guys are doing in that regard. And of course, your feedback and support is always, always appreciated. So with all my announcements and news out of the way, I guess it's time to get on to Frog of the Week. Oh, before I forget, also, I did a wonderful long conversation with the Blood Satellite, their podcast, the wonderful Canadian guys. And do keep an eye out for that. I will be, if you don't follow them, you should. I just had a great conversation with Dimes. He's fantastic. And we're going to be getting some work done in that regard, maybe for more future conversations. I really liked how well we hit it off. So I will be sure to post that in the community tab and Twitter and Telegram and everywhere I can. So keep that in mind. So I think that's all the announcements I have. And now we're going to move on to the ever so wonderful Frog of the Week. All right, so this week's Frog of the Week is the Colombian four-eyed frog. It is a lovely little creature that you can see here on your right. It is native to South America, all the way from the northern parts of Brazil up towards Panama, Guyana, most of the northern regions of South and Central America around the Panama Canal as well. And if you wonder why it is called the four-eyed frog, it has two large quote-unquote eyes in its rear. You can kind of see them in the picture there. It's a vital defense mechanisms for its survival because those are poisonous glands. So anytime that this frog is threatened by a predator, it will literally bury its head into the ground, lift its rear end up as high as it can in order for predators to think that it's a larger animal. And if they get too close, then they're exposed to a very toxic and deadly poison. So it's a very important defense mechanism for its survival. Its natural habitat is usually not wetlands or marshlands. It's usually grasslands and savannas, drier areas. They mate and breed in semi-permanent bodies of water, streams, ponds, areas in which there's a lot of rainfall where it can find a ditch or something that's been filled up in order to breed. But they mainly do hide and burrow in the dirt. They're a burrowing frog, and they will simply wait to come out in the rains to do their business, to feed, to mate, and so on. So that is this week's wonderful Frog of the Week, the Colombian four-eyed frog. There are some lovely pictures that you can find with its rear end sticking up, and it really does look like two black eyes are just staring at you. A really interesting and unique creature in God's kingdom. So, as always, thank you so much for listening today. I know that this one is pre-recorded. We will be back to our regular live schedule next week. The only time that I do foresee myself not doing anything live will be the weekend of Father's Day. I will be doing some Orthodox basket weaving that weekend. So I will be off and away somewhere else. But there will be, of course, another live recorded lecture and conversation for you all to enjoy because this is the Sunday stream and we do try to keep it live here. So, of course, thank you to my top tier patrons who are listed on screen right now who donate $20 or more a month on Subscribestar. You guys are fantastic. I will probably be using some of this money to help make a payment for a car. I need to buy a more fuel efficient vehicle, to say the least, along with some other things. It's time that I probably put the old Ford out to be retired. I've had that thing now for almost half my life. But your support via Subscribestar, Super Chats, YouTube memberships, or even just buying merch. I do have a merch link down below. Lovely mugs, t-shirts, and socks of all sorts of geopolitical and Frog of the Week conversation. So you guys make it all wonderful and possible. I will see you all next time in the next video. I want you all to take care, have a fantastic Sunday, and be prudent, everyone. God bless.